I'm very proud of each and every one of our speakers, but I may be a little extra proud of this one for two reasons. The first is that Ben Bergen is an awesome cognitive scientist, professor of cognitive science at UCSD. I've written a little blurb, make sure I don't miss anything. But before I read the blurb, and I've mentioned this a few times today, so please indulge if you've heard it already, but Ben was my TA when I was an undergrad, some number of years ago, and hair. And I haven't had a chance to tell him this, but on reflection, I think Ben was very much an inspiration for going into academia. As an impressionable youngster with wayward tendencies, I saw this, very happy person who was really engaged with research in a way that seemed like a calling and seemed like something that was leading him to lead like a very flourishing kind of life. And then, of course, I put that away for about 5 years and didn't go to grad school. But I think there was a little Ben, or a little impression of what it could be like. It was largely informed by my interactions with this really great TA named Ben. And it wasn't just one class, mind you. This was an impression that accrued over, we can't figure out how many classes. So it's really kind of special to me that almost 20 years later, I get to welcome him here to share his work with us. Now, for the one of you who may not know, who is this guy? Well, Ben Bergen is a professor of CogSci at UCSD, whose work focuses primarily on language. But along the way, he explores basic questions about concepts, mental simulation, embodiment, learning, driving, swearing, the list goes on. So Ben's work has been presented in any number of journal articles and conference proceedings, and he's also authored 2 books. The first, Louder Than Words, The New Science of How the Mind Makes Meaning. And most recently, because they say write what you know, What the F? What Swearing Reveals About Our Language, Our Brains, and Ourselves. So please join me in welcoming Ben Bergen.
Thanks, Colin. I bear no responsibility for whatever Colin does now in professional life.
You're my TA too. You forgot.
Was it really?
Uh-huh. Yeah. Quality in the flesh.
Oh, yeah, probably. That's right. Wow, look at us. We won't say what decade that was. Okay, so thank you so much. It's always a pleasure to be here. And first of all, I have to apologize. I'm not going to talk about swearing today. I did that last time I was here. It was fun. I offended lots of people. It was great. But so I'm going to move on to another topic that I think is really exciting to me right now, which is ambiguity. Before I jump in, I want to recognize the people who have contributed to this work, even maybe more than I have. And most prominent among these is Sean Trott, my grad student, who's doing fantastic work, and you will hear a lot more from him in the future. Stephanie Reed's an undergraduate in the lab, and Vic Ferrer is a psychologist who's worked on some of the experiments that I'll talk about today. And so if there's anything that goes right in this talk, then it's largely Sean's responsibility. And if there's anything that goes wrong, then I have only myself to blame. Okay, so in the first part, I'm going to talk to you about ambiguity in language. And language is ambiguous at every level, from the speech signal all the way through what you mean to do with the sentences that you produce. And rather than try to convince you of that, I'm going to demonstrate it to you using Muppets. So about 3 months ago, the internet went all a Twitter about how Grover was swearing on Sesame Street. Anyone familiar with this? So here's, actually, I want to make sure I have sound here. I don't think I have sound actually for this. Because it's through the wrong thingy. Do we have a different sound?
HDMI, you should have something.
It's HDMI, but it's HDMI through the Apple converter thing. Do we have audio connection? I will pump it up, but you're not going to be able to hear it. Okay, so we're gonna try this. This intuition pump may or may not pump your intuition. So here's Grover.
Yes, that's like an excellent idea. All right.
So some people hear, that sounds like an excellent idea. Some people hear something else. Did anyone hear anything else? Okay, so I'm gonna play it again. So you're listening for, that's a fucking excellent idea. That's what you're listening for.
Move it to follow you. Move the camera! Yes! Yes, that's a fucking excellent Move the camera! Yes! Yes, that's a fucking excellent
Okay, so the point here, this is a large part of why ASR, why speech recognition software has taken the many decades that it's taken. It's because there's not a one-to-one mapping between the signal, the acoustic signal, and the sounds and words that are supposed to be conveyed by it. In fact, it's actually much more complicated than that. And the speech signal ambiguities that you see here are present in everything from the Yanny-Laurel illusion to mondegreens. So those are lyrics that can be interpreted in different ways. Excuse me while I kiss this guy, or kiss this guy. And so on. The speech signal is very ambiguous. Even if you know what the right sounds are, such that you've identified a particular word, you don't know what that word means, because words have lots of different meanings. Hopefully the sound, you'll be able to hear this as well.
And I have to ask for an audition. Do you have an audition yet? Oh, no, I'm not in the group yet. So I'm afraid I just blew myself.
The stare at the end makes it. So we said, I just blew myself. Okay, so this is lexical ambiguity. Even if you know what the words are, you don't know what they mean. This is a case of homonymy. There are two words, blue and blue, that happen to sound exactly the same. There's no reason for them to. But many words have multiple meanings. And as a consequence, we don't always know what the words are. Even if you've identified the words and you know which meanings they are supposed to have, you may not know what the sentence means, because the sequence of words that you put together can have different interpretations. This is an example of what's called an attachment ambiguity. Hopefully you'll be able to hear this.
One morning I shot an elephant in my pajamas. How they got to my pajamas, I don't know.
Okay, the attachment is between the prepositional phrase "in my pajamas" to the thing that it's supposed to be modifying. So is it modifying I, or is it modifying the elephant? There are lots of other types of syntactic ambiguity, like this: scope ambiguities, bracketing ambiguities, old men and women. Does it mean old men and women of any age, or does it mean old men and old women? Garden paths, and so on. Psycholinguistics was basically, like 30 years of psycholinguistics was basically on this. And even if you know what the sentence is, and you've figured out its structure, you may not know what the words refer to. Even if you know what they mean, you may not be able to figure out reference. Here's an example of failed reference.
Does your dick back? No. That's different. I thought you said your dick was not bad. That was not my dog.
So if you didn't hear it, he said, I thought you were going to say your dog didn't bite. That is not my dog. Okay, so my dog, you can perfectly well understand what my dog is, but you have to be able to ground it out in the real world at some point. That's a referential ambiguity, a reference ambiguity, and this is possibly the most pervasive kind of ambiguity, because our most frequent words are referentially ambiguous. Every time you say he, or now, or here, these rely on being grounded in some model of what that refers to. And then finally, and this is the kind of ambiguity that I'm going to be focusing on mostly in this talk, you don't necessarily know, even if you've solved all those problems, what a person really intends by saying a sentence. Because in fact, we mostly don't say what we mean or mean what we say. Here's an example of exploiting this fact.
Sometimes they'll say, do you know what time it is? And I say, yes.
Okay, he said, people will say, do you know what time it is? And I say, yes. Okay, the reason that's ambiguous is, of course, that it's a request for information. It's not and not of the type of information that it explicitly looks like it's a request for. Okay, so this type of ambiguity is pragmatic ambiguity, and we know that it's very challenging to solve. it's largely, it's a large part of the reason that the devices that you interact with through language are unable to interact like humans. Even if you've solved speech recognition, you've solved lots of problems in terms of syntactic ambiguity, and you can figure out which sense of the word is more likely and so on. This is really hard. And the ways that this is really hard is a large part of what we're going to get at today. But before I get to that, I just want to give you a sense for exactly how much ambiguity we're talking about here. If you compose at all of these levels the quantity of ambiguity that you have, how much ambiguity are we really talking about? And here's just one piece of evidence. In the 40s, Zipf asked how many meanings do words have in general? And he found that, and this has been replicated in lots of more recent studies, he found that in general, words with, this is the rank of words. So these are the 500 most frequent words in a language, all the way down to words that are the 20,000th most frequent word in a language. And then on the y-axis here, you see the average number of meanings of those words. And so you can see that even if the numbers are approximate, that most words have at least two meanings. At least most of the most frequent words have at least two meanings. And that the words that you use most frequently have even more meanings than that. And so George Miller, who was one of the founders of WordNet, among lots of other things, just did some really simple math on this. And he said, okay, take a sentence, take a couplet from Robert Frost, and look in WordNet and see how many senses each of those words have, and just multiply. So you pick the 12 possible senses for button and the 3 possible sentences for I, and you multiply that out, and at the end of the couplet you get 3 trillion different possible combinations for that sentence. Okay, so that goes to the point. Now that's just words, right? That's not including their syntactic structures. And in fact, syntax may constrain this. It might become easier when you know that there's syntactic contingencies and so on. But all of this means that there's a problem. And the problem is this: ambiguity is prevalent. I'm not going to say exactly how prevalent. Not necessarily 3 trillion interpretations per sentence prevalent, but it's prevalent. And this is a challenge for communication. It has to be. And we know this because this is not how we design programming languages. Imagine a programming language designed such that there were 13 trillion interpretations of a line of code. So if the objective is simply transmitting information from one person to another, or one communicator to another, then this is not well designed. However, we think that language evolved over biological and cultural time to serve communication. That's in fact what we largely use it for. And you would think that anything that evolved over those timescales should be optimized for communication along some parameters. Now, that doesn't mean it has to mean no ambiguity whatsoever, but it shouldn't be that there are 3 trillion interpretations for a sentence. So I'm not the first person to notice this quandary, and people have dealt with it in a variety of different ways. One way is the Chomskyan approach, which is to say, well, no, actually, this isn't a contradiction because language didn't actually evolve for communication. And so he basically takes this contradiction as evidence against premise 3. And he says, okay, therefore, there's no reason to believe that language should be optimized for efficient communication. If it didn't evolve for communication, it shouldn't be optimized for it. And here's how he says it. The natural approach in asking about how language has come to be the way that it is has always been to ask, is it well designed for use, typically understood as use for communication? I think that's the wrong question. The use of language for communication might turn out to be a kind of a phenomenon. If you want to make sure that we never misunderstand one another for that purpose, language is not well designed because you have such properties as ambiguity. So, I mean, I think that there are a variety of things that could be said about this. Chomsky's argument is going to be that language is for thought, not for communication. It's sort of an internal mechanism. Even if that's true, and I think that we can come up with lots of arguments why it might not be true, still this would only apply to those parts of language that evolved for thought. And on the Chomskyan account, that's just certain high-level principles of grammar. This would not explain pragmatic ambiguity, why you say, do you have the time? It would not explain lexical ambiguity. It would not explain signal ambiguity. it would not liberate language from having to explain those things, because those are things that presumably happened over cultural time, right? The words change their meanings and sounds over cultural time. People come up with different ways to ask a question over cultural time. Those are things that probably evolved. So we still need to explain why it's inefficient in those ways, even if we admit the possibility that language didn't evolve for communication yet.
Is he like making that distinction though? Because it starts out saying the natural approach. Is he not distinguishing the natural approach from like the cultural?
So by him, the natural approach means the approach that most theoreticians have taken. So naturally, you would ask, you would pose. So he said. So what I've posed here as the problem is the natural approach.
Okay.
You know, language is for communication. Language is bad at communication. What's up with that? And he's saying, well, that's actually wrong. Okay, so that's the Chomskyan argument. I think it doesn't explain most of ambiguity, if it explains any of it. There's a second approach, which is the Pinker et al. Approach, which is to deny that ambiguity makes language inefficient for communication. And he argues that, no, actually, ambiguity is really helpful because it affords plausible deniability. And the argument goes like this. It's a really juicy, well-written paper. It has all the Pinkerian flair that you would expect. He writes, in a simple case like bribing a police officer, because that's all that language is used for, the appeal of a veiled bribe is intuitively clear. If some officers are corrupt and would accept the bribe, but others are honest and might arrest the driver for bribery, an indirect bribe can be detected by the corrupt cop while not being blatant enough for the honest cop to prove it beyond a reasonable doubt. A simple game theoretic model can delineate the circumstances in which indirect speech is an optimal solution to this problem. Okay, so I think this is, yes, did you know, was that a question? I think this is probably true. In certain circumstances, it probably is advantageous to not have to go out on a limb and make absolutely crystal clear what your intention is. And the paper, Pinker et al. Go on to elaborate other ways in which, you know, arrest isn't at stake, but just sort of social face, or there's social things that are on the line. And I certainly think there are certain circumstances in which that's true, but again, it doesn't explain most of ambiguity. It's not clear that there's any advantage to not knowing what this refers to, whether this refers to this or to this. That doesn't gain me anything with respect to plausible deniability, or similarly so for 3 trillion reasons. A final solution, and the one that I think is most appealing in its general framework, and the one that's going to drive the questions that we pursue today, follows along lines that Zip started, 70 years ago, and Piantadosi and colleagues had a paper like this, elaborating on this a couple of years ago. And the basic idea is that ambiguity is present because it facilitates production. So the idea goes like this: language involves interactions. Production is the hard part, because you have to not only know what you're going to say, but you've got to pick all the ways that you're going to say it. You've got to pick the words, you've got to remember how to articulate them, you have to actually articulate them, you have to put them together with other words and grammar and so on. And you have to do this in real time, right? If you pause, right? It's super awkward. People hate it. No one likes it. So the onus is on the producer to keep doing things, and that's hard. And so anything you can do to make their job easier helps communication in general, especially if, and this is premise number 2, you also have a really competent comprehender, who also, by the way, is a producer when they're talking. So the comprehender now has a little bit more latitude. They aren't on the hook to actually say things. They may have more time to reflect. They hear the words and then they get some time. They can pay attention or not to what's said next if they decide that something is important to focus on. They have more resources at their disposal. And they're not multitasking. They're not both producing something and planning what's happening next. So maybe this is a way to offload more labor onto the comprehender. So that's basically the idea. Ambiguity is a desirable property of communication systems because it allows for a communication system which is short and simple, ambiguity allows the reuse of words and sounds which are more easily produced or understood. So the basic idea is, why would you have homonyms? Well, you have homonyms, why would you have two, and two? It seems terrible. Those are like really frequent words. The argument would be, well, it's because two is an easy thing to say because you say it all the time and it's short and it sounds really like an English word sounds. And so it's easy for producers to just say that word and let comprehenders figure it out on the back end. And similarly for pragmatic ambiguity. You say, do you have the time? In part, because it's easier to say that than to specify, I'm interested in knowing the time and this is a request for you to tell me what time it is. Okay, so that's a really appealing idea. And I think that largely what's been underexplored are two assumptions that it builds in. And those assumptions are the following. The first is that in order for this to actually work, there have to be components of the signal, the communicative signal as a whole, that allow for disambiguation. So what could those things be? They could be things like what I'm doing with my hands. So it could be that gestures, interactions through language are often multimodal. So it could be visual signals that are being produced by the hands, head, eyes, body. They could be things that are in the speech signals that are not the words themselves, so prosody, for example. They could be things in the linguistic context. So there could be clues in the words that preceded the word that's present. They could be things that I know as a comprehender about this particular speaker, and so on. But there must be something in the context for me to use to disambiguate. And the second premise is that you, the comprehender, must be well designed to use those signals. Otherwise, it's not going to make language communication more efficient. And so those are the two premises that I'm going to be addressing. And just to give you a little flavor for how this works, I'm going to use a visual ambiguity to give you the flavor for context and what the comprehender has to be like. So this is so we know from visual ambiguity that when you provide some context, an ambiguous image all of a sudden pops into a category. And we know that in different contexts, that same image may take on different identities. In order for you to be able to do this, both the context has to be informative, and you have to know, in this case, you have to know about sequences in a particular writing or numerical system. The same, I'd argue, is probably true about words. So in one context, you're going to come up with an interpretation of the word bank, which in this case is a noun. And in another context, you might come up with another interpretation of that same word. But again, you have to have the scaffolding context, and you have to have a comprehender who's the right kind of comprehender. And so there are kind of three questions in this research program. The first is there information in the signal or in the context surrounding the signal that's informative with respect to the intent that a speaker has? Second, can human comprehenders use that information to disambiguate? And then finally, how do they do so? And how do they do so is it gets us into the core cognitive science of this, right? What are the mechanisms that people are deploying? And are those mechanisms ones that we can leverage for engineering applications? Okay, so let's talk about inferring intent using context. That was part one. Is there information in the context? And then do humans use it? Like I said, I'm going to stay at a pretty high level here with pragmatic inference. And I'll give you a parade example. So if I say, it's kind of cold in here. So depending on who you are and what our relationship is and what you know about me and what I know about you, that could mean a bunch of different things, right? It could mean it is cold in here. Like, congratulations, I wanted it to be cold in here. You made it cold in here. It's cold in here now. Or it could be an answer to a question. Is it warm in here or colder in here? It's cold in here. But of course, it could be an indirect speech act as well, right? I could be using that same declarative utterance, it's cold in here, to mean please turn on the heater, or please get me a blanket, or something like that, right? And these indirect speech acts are important because they're frequent. In studies of people making requests, something on the order of 80 to 90% of requests that humans utter are indirect in this way. That sounds like a lot, right? So, I mean, just think about the engineering application. So you're talking to, this confronts you if you're talking to your Google Home. how do you request things from your Google Home? Well, either it has to train you that you have to ask in a particular way, or it's going to have to respond to the fact that 80 to 90% of the time that you're asking for things, it's incorrect. But it's also important with respect to human interactions and language and so on. Okay, so how are we able to resolve which of these intentions we should come away with as comprehenders? Well, if language is designed with information alongside the signal, then it must be out there somewhere for me to reliably be able to infer what you intended. One idea about this comes from Ray Gibbs' work, and he argues that that comprehenders in general infer intentions on the basis of the inferred mental states of the speaker. So for example, in this case, in the case of it's cold in here, what might modulate my understanding of that? Well, let's see. If it's about a heater, let's say, if you say it's cold in here, and I know that the heater's broken, and I know that you know that the heater's broken, that's probably not a request to turn on the heater. It's more likely to be a complaint or something, or maybe an indirect request of a different type. Maybe you're asking me to bring you a blanket, but you're not asking me to turn on the heater because I know that you know that the heater's broken. Now, this is by hypothesis, but no one's tested this. This idea that maybe people are projecting into, in order to understand indirect requests like this, maybe people are modeling the mental states of others. So we came up with a relatively, I mean, it seems simple on the surface, but every time I try to explain it, I get confused. So maybe not so simple way to test this. It's basically a linguistic version of the false belief task. A false belief task, someone is aware or unaware of something in the environment, and and the subject is meant to respond on the basis of their knowledge about this other's beliefs. So we did this with language, and here's how we did it. So we created pairs of narratives that ended with a potential indirect request. So they ended with something like, it's cold in here. And in each case, there was an obstacle to fulfilling that request, like the heater is either broken, like the fact that the heater is broken. But the manipulation is that the speaker either knows about that or doesn't know about that obstacle. So just like I was saying, either the speaker knows that the heater is broken or doesn't know that the heater is broken and then says, it's cold in here. And the question is basically, does that modulate what the comprehender thinks the speaker intended? And so this is how the passages would be. You and your friend are on a road trip, blah, blah, blah. You stop at a gas station in a small town. And then you have two conditions. You fill up the tank, and then the two of you go inside. This is in the speaker aware condition. The two of you go inside to buy some water and snacks. When you return to the car and start up the engine, you and your friend notice with some dismay a blinking light, which indicates that the car's heating system is broken. You both bundle up. Okay, that's the version where both you and Jonathan are aware that the heater is broken. And then there's the version where Jonathan is not aware, but you are aware that the heater is broken because Jonathan goes inside, but as you're checking the meter, you notice the blinking light, which indicates that the heater is broken, and then Jonathan comes back to the car. And then Jonathan says, Jonathan shivers and he turns to you and says, man, it's really cold in here. Okay, so the idea is, if as a comprehender, you are monitoring, so you're sampling what Jonathan knows, and you are retaining that all the way to the end here, and you are deploying that to make an inference about what he really meant by this ambiguous sentence, then you should be more likely to say that this sentence here is a request when, this is how we always get confused. You should be more likely to say that it's a request when he is not aware of the obstacle, right? Because if you were aware of the obstacle, then it wouldn't be a request to turn on the heater. Okay. So we did this as a paraphrase judgment. So what did Jonathan mean by man, it's really cold in here? Did he mean, can you turn on the heater, or it's really cold, too bad the heater doesn't work? And so it's just request or non-request. And so this is what we found. People are very substantially pushed around by this manipulation. And they're pushed around from the very first trial, so this is not a learning effect. This same magnitude of effect on the very first trial of 8. Now, you might say, well, why aren't they at 100% and at 0%? Well, because there could be other requests, right? He could be asking you to hand him a blanket or something, right? So the absence of one possibility doesn't preclude other possibilities. But this is a bigger effect than we usually get in the lab in pretty much anything we do. So pretty confident that whatever we're doing is pushing this around. So this was meant to get at ambiguity, right? What this shows us is that this very simple little study, very simple but hard to explain little study, is that participants are spontaneously sampling the contextual information. So there is information in context here. And when that information is available, participants are sampling it, and they're using it to make inferences about speaker knowledge states. And this inferable information predicted how they disambiguated this sentence. So both comprehenders have access to information and they can use it. But then how, the question 3 is, well, what are they doing mechanistically? How are they using it? And we were interested in the idea that maybe there are individual differences that could tell us something about how they're using it. In particular, we were interested in the mental states part. Are there differences in how people are able to sample and then deploy knowledge of others' mental states? So to get at this individual difference, we just quantified the magnitude of the effect here. So this is basically, so you can measure this as a kind of it's a sensitivity effect. How much are they? How much do they say that a response was likely to be a request in the unaware condition minus in the aware condition? And larger values for this are going to mean that people are more sensitive to the contextual information about the speaker's knowledge, and smaller values less so. And actually, in this first study, if you quantify this, you find that there's quite a bit of variability in terms of the magnitude of this effect. Some people are performing categorically, some people are performing at chance, and a whole range of responses. And so we wanted to know whether we could explain the magnitudes of these effects using some characteristic of the individual participants. Like, who are these people? Are they different from these people along some interesting thing that tells us something about their ability to infer mental states of other people? So we used a construct to measure mentalizing ability. So mentalizing ability is the ability to, well, it depends on who you ask, but to infer, to represent, to use mental states of others. And so we used a particular mentalizing task, which targets language. Mentalizing is in language comprehension. It's called the short story task. And the question was, does an individual's mentalizing ability on a completely separate task predict the magnitude of their effect in our task? Are the better mentalizers the ones who are sensitive to contextual information in disambiguating what a speaker intends by what they say? And a short story task, it's this cool task where people read a story by Ernest Hemingway. I'll send you my slide. There's nothing proprietary here. In fact, this is the paper. This is this paper. Right, so they read the end of something, which, if you're a fan of Hemingway, is not Hemingway's greatest work. I wouldn't say, actually, it's probably one of his worst works, but it has a lot of really juicy interpersonal sort of conflict. And then they have to answer a bunch of questions. And importantly, they answer questions that allow us to measure their reading comprehension ability so that we can parcel that out. We don't want to just be getting the better comprehenders. We want to get the people who are better at explicit mental state reasoning. Like, if we ask them, why did this person say this thing? We want them to be able to go really deep. Well, he said this because he thought that she was going to say that. So we want those people. And so here's a little bit of an example of a passage from this not greatest Hemingway story. Not everyone's work is their best work, right? That's some papers that maybe I'm not advertising. Okay. There's going to be a moon tonight, said Nick. He looked across the bay to the hills that were beginning to sharpen against the sky. Beyond the hills, he knew the moon was coming up. I know it, Marjorie said happily. You know everything, said Nick. Oh, Nick, please cut it out. Please don't be that way. I can't help it, Nick said. You do. You know everything. That's the trouble. You know you do. Okay, so, and then they get a question at the end of this passage where they have to go back through and explain things like, why does Nick say to Marjorie, you know everything? Now, in the context of this story, if you were doing a really superficial pass and you didn't really care about who did what, about mental states, you might say, the least mental state reasoning thing would be to say, he says she knows everything because she does know everything, and he thinks that she knows everything. A deeper interpretation would be because he's trying to antagonize her, because he wants to get out of the situation, because he wants to break up with her. Actually, that's what the whole thing is about. He's trying to break up with her. He's trying to start a fight. And so getting out of the boat, they're on a boat. Getting out of the boat and getting out of the relationship, the end of something is the metaphor. It's not a good allegory. But anyway, that's where that would demonstrate deeper mental state reasoning, and we use the coding scheme from the original setup and condition blind reviewers, coders tag these things for depth of explicit mental state reasoning. There's good reliability across coders, and then we ask for this task of ours. Remember, go back to the Jonathan in the car. So, are the people who are better at figuring out what Jonathan means the people who are better mental state reasoners, who are really going deeply into who knows what and thinks what? So this is experiment 2's results. You can be excused for thinking that these were the experiment 1 results. They look exactly the same. Very happy about that. But then when we quantify this difference and then correlate it with explicit mental state reasoning from this short story task, what we find is this. So this is density plot. So you have so on the x-axis you have mentalizing score. So these are higher mentalizers over here, and these are lower mentalizers on the short story task. So here are people who really get Hemingway, and these are people who didn't so much. And then and then here you see the 2 conditions. So the congruent condition is this blob here, where congruent is they answered it in the predicted way. So request if in unaware and non-request in aware. And then pink is people who responded incongruently, right? And what you see is that although there's a good deal of overlap, there's actually a pretty big difference in the kind of predicted direction. That is, the better mentalizers were more likely to answer congruently than the less good mentalizers. And in case you're worried that that's explained by reading comprehension, as we were, we included reading comprehension in the model, and then just did a model comparison where we included or excluded that interaction, this interaction of congruency by mentalizing score, and it's still a big effect. So better mentalizers appear to be better at inferring intention. So just to sum up, speaker knowledge, again, predicted comprehender disambiguation. So when that information is available, which it can be available, comprehenders can use it. They don't do so uniformly. And when they do so, they appear to be, at least in part, using mentalizing ability. Now, mentalizing ability is not something that we think, at least, is specifically evolved for language use. We mentalize for lots of reasons. We want to infer intentions of other people around us for lots of types of action and not just speaking. So it seems as though, at least in this case, the cognitive environment that a comprehender comes to language with now, and maybe did 50,000 years ago, is particularly helpful for a language which underspecifies intent explicitly. Okay, one other line of work that asks a very similar question, but just on a different part of the context. Not what could we know about this particular person and their knowledge state, but from the speech signal itself. So prosody is all the sounds in speech that aren't the words themselves. So the intonation, the ups and downs, the stress, the rhythm, the pauses. That's the prosody of an utterance. And it's long been thought that prosody may help comprehenders disambiguate for a variety of reasons. In computational systems that are trying to figure out what dialogue act or speech act someone is engaged in. Is it a question? Is it a request? Is it an assertion? Is it an accusation? Researchers have found that computational systems are better at classifying if you include prosodic information. Similarly, there was a recent study that did this cool study in German where they had trained voice actors produce words, single words, and intend to get certain messages across. So the key word that they use in all the examples, because it's in German, is beer, and the actors were supposed to say beer in 8 different ways. So as a criticism, as a warning, as a suggestion, I can see as a request. Yeah, criticism is hard. I don't know exactly how they would do it, but in any case, a classifier can classify these at about 55 to 60% accuracy, and humans are about the same, with just a word. So it seems like there's something available potentially in terms of useful information. And then the question is, okay, now let's get to actual sentences, to humans saying things with intentions. Are there prosodic signals that are available? And do humans use it, and how? So, okay, so we're going to use the same example of indirect requests, in fact, the very same sentences. We had 5 English speakers who were not trained actors. They were what do you call research assistants. Produce request and non-request versions of 16 sentences. 6 of them were sort of conventional requests, like, can you open that window? So this can you thing, when you actually think about it, it's actually an indirect request, right? You're asking about ability. Do you have the muscle strength to open this window? Is what you're actually asking. But what you mean is not that. Sometimes. But then sometimes you do mean that. And we ask them to say the sentences in each of 2 ways. And then half of the sentences were non-conventional ones. So things like, my soup is cold, which is just a declarative sentence, right? Okay, so, and then we took these recordings and fed them to Turkers. And these Turkers listened to pairs of sentences and just had to say which of these is the request. And I'm going to let you experience, I don't have the sound again, that's challenging. Okay, well, I'll hopefully crank it and see if we got this loud enough. Okay, which was the request, the first one or the second one?
Can you lift that box? Can you lift that box?
You hear that? I'll play it again, because this is,
Can you lift that box? Can you lift that box?
which is the request? I think it was actually the second one, but okay. Okay, so that one, okay, so that's the easy one. I know it's very hard for you guys to hear any of these. I mean, in the front of the room you can hear it. Okay, here's the even harder one. Can't hear it at all. Yeah. It basically said, my back is really sore. My back is really sore. So there sometimes is and sometimes is not much signal here. But what we found was that okay, so you have the 5 speakers here along the x-axis, and you have the non-conventional ones. That's my back is really sore, and the conventional ones. Can you open that window? And on the y-axis you have accuracy. So this is mean accuracy, and what you see is that for each of the speakers, even the ones that sound like we have them on morphine, are above chance. Chance is here, this red dotted line, and for both types of sentence, people are above chance. So that's actually quite promising to us. It seems like there's a signal that people can produce using just prosody. There's no video here; it's just sound. They're using the exact same words, and yet comprehenders are able to use them to discriminate intent, to disambiguate. Yeah.
Just a quick question. What are the black dots? Are those outliers?
Outliers.
Yeah. It's just they look so flat and uniform to each other.
They're, remember this is, let's see, why would they be flat? They're flat because, let's see, there are 12 sentences. Yeah, there are 12 sentences, so it's divided by 12. Okay, so people are able to use these cues to discriminate intent, but which cues are they using? So we did a very dumb analysis, which is that we just extracted some acoustic features that had previously in the literature been associated with intent. Using this cool package that I recommend for Prot and Python called Parcel-Mouth. And you may have heard of it. Right, so those features were so in fundamental frequency is just the pitch of the speech. And then what's the mean pitch over the course of the thing is the variance, the range of pitch, slope of pitch over time. We looked at the intensity, so mean and standard deviation of intensity, and then the duration, how much talking was there in this thing. But there's lots of variation, of course, across people. You heard there were some very high voices, some very low voices. All this was Z-scored, obviously, for the individuals. And what we found was that, so then we asked which of these features predicts the intent that the speaker had for that sentence. So we basically flipped it on its head and did a logistic regression. So these were the factors used to predict what had the speaker intended in the first place. And we found lots of factors. So in an overall model, there were effects for slope, intensity, F0 slope, mean intensity, and standard deviation of intensity. And then if you look only at the subset of conventional and non-conventional requests, there are a bunch of features here. Now, I'm not going to go into all the details of why these features. All I want to do is to say, hey, there are some features that differ, and in fact, and not the same features depending on the type of grammatical structure. So that's interesting. That means that there's kind of an interaction here between the grammatical structure of the thing and the prosodic features that are going to be relevant. But just to give you a sense of this, this is just for one feature. So this was for the slope of fundamental frequency. The requests had a much lower slope in fundamental frequency than the non-requests did. Which you can kind of see here. Now, and this is actually an example of why I said this is a dumb method, right? So it picks up a more of a slope in stims like this than in stims like this. Yeah, I mean, yeah, sure, I guess that's true. There's lots of error regardless of what slope you try to put on this. There's going to be lots of error, so it's going to fit. There's going to be a positive slope that fits this better. Really, if we were to do this right, and the next time we do this, or the next analysis that we'll do, will probably be a more local analysis rather than looking at sort of global features of the speech signal. But all this was to say that the devil is probably going to be in the details. Nevertheless, even with these really dumb features, they're pretty good for classification. So if we then take these 120 utterances that we gave to humans, and we train classifiers on them. We tried a bunch of different classifiers. We always end up with great results. The classifiers are fantastic. So this is a typical result where this is the classifier output. The likelihood that it was a non-request. Or literal. So as you can see, it's doing a great job. There might be a little bias here or something like that, but in general, it's quite good at classifying. So where are we so far? So people can produce discriminable signals. People can then hear those prosodic cue enlaced speech signals and discriminate them relatively well. And there are actually some prosodic cues that we can pick up on that are predictive, and those can be used to classify relatively successfully. So are humans using the same cues that the classifier is? That's harder to say, but we just, to take one foray into asking that question, we did the following. We fit a model, actually the same model from when we were just looking at humans before. Basically a model that says, how likely is a human to, it's a logistic regression. How likely is a human to say that this one is the request versus this one is the request as a function of the condition that the speaker intended that to be in. And then on top of that model, we add acoustic cues. And we ask, is there added value beyond what actual condition that was intended to be in for various acoustic cues? And we use the same acoustic cues as before, and what we find is that the model fit is improved by fundamental frequency slope, fundamental frequency and mean intensity, two of which showed up in our acoustic model as being significant predictors. Okay, here's what I want to take out. speakers can produce discriminable cues to disambiguate pragmatic intent. These are manifested in reliable differences across some acoustic features. These acoustic features predict human accuracy. So therefore, to tie this all together, the signal is there, or is potentially there. Humans can produce it, and comprehenders can use it to disambiguate potentially pragmatically ambiguous utterance. Okay, so I want to go back to where we started and sort of see what all of this means. I started with this problem, which is ambiguity is prevalent. Ambiguity makes language inefficient for communication, but we think that language evolved for communication and should therefore be optimized for efficient communication. So I think what we can now say, we've gained a little bit of traction on this. We can now say that ambiguity is prevalent in principle, but actually there's a lot of disambiguating information in the signal. And comprehenders actually disambiguate using context, using multimodal cues. So the actual realized ambiguity, those cases where there aren't cues available to an appropriate comprehender, is, at least we can say, smaller than the apparent ambiguity when you start. And this may be largely because we have this practice of taking language out of context, right? We ask, is this word ambiguous? Is the word bank ambiguous? Yeah, the word bank is ambiguous if you don't include it in the situation in which it's actually used. Realized ambiguity may prove to show that potential ambiguity is smaller than, is overstated, I guess is a way to say it. To the premise that, therefore, I guess the consequence that ambiguity makes language inefficient for communication, maybe not as much as we thought, because those cues are available and because comprehenders have a lot of work to do, but it seems to be the type of work that they're good at. Humans are good at tracking mental states of others from age 2 or something. And there's lots of individual variation in this, so looking at different neurotypes is actually super informative with respect to ability to comprehend indirect speech types and so on. But so for many developmentally typical adult humans, the things that language ambiguity requires you to do is exactly what you're good at. That's convenient. I'm going to skip 3 and come back to it in just a second. The idea that, therefore, language should be optimized for efficient communication, maybe what this tells us is that it is. It is actually optimized in a way for efficient communication because it's optimized to allow humans to do the things that they are good at doing, like reasoning about other humans, or paying attention to multiple modalities of information at the same time. And therefore, it's possible that language did in fact evolve for communication, and that ambiguity is part of that evolution. That language has evolved to fill a cognitive niche, where humans are good at certain things, like reading the intents of others, for example, and that languages have changed over biological or cultural time to be the types of communication systems that exploit that maximum. Okay, here's my last slide. If you segment language, take it out of context, and act like a butterfly collector, then pieces of language may appear potentially ambiguous. But in fact, the more we dig into this, the more we discover that there are actually clues in context and in the signal itself, in multiple modalities, that that lead language to not produce effective ambiguities, because humans in fact are able to use those contexts. And I think that this creates lots of opportunities in this framework to understand how human language processing, as compared with either theoretical models, a very simple theoretical model that just multiplies the senses of each word as you go, for example, or any other, or computational implementations, for example, how humans are able to, how human cognitive processing works as compared with near neighbors. Humans appear to disambiguate using multimodal contextual information as well as diverse cognitive systems, including mentalizing, which suggests not only avenues for future research, but also avenues for facilitating naturalistic human-machine interactions through language. I thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to the conversation.
is that the students enrolled in the seminar get the first 15 minutes.
Fantastic. Those will be the good questions. Yeah, in the back first.
Does it matter that in vivo a comprehender can ask for clarity? So, for instance,
Yes.
in the stories, can't really ask Jonathan what he meant. But if you said it's cold in here, I could then respond, "Do you want me to turn on the heat?" To sort of ask you directly, "Are you actually making a request?" And
Yep.
how much does the comprehender's ability to seek clarification play into your theorizing?
Yeah, fantastic. So, so those sorts of repair are absolutely exist, and people who do sort of discourse analysis find them and point to them as a corrective measure that happens as humans are coordinating an interaction. They're super rare though, and so what's interesting about them is that it exists. But the fact that they're so rare suggests one of a couple of things. Either they're not necessary because we're just really good at coordinating, or they're socially costly. And even though we fail to coordinate in some circumstances, we don't want to waste the time, or we don't care enough about what you actually mean, or we don't want to seem like we're not paying attention or don't understand, and so we don't say them. So they, what do? They suggest that humans can be interacting, can be aware of these ambiguities, can correct them, but they rarely use that avenue. Yeah.
Great talk, by the way. Very unambiguous through the whole thing. So.
Yeah. In practice, but potentially.
Yeah. With regards to the problem that you presented at the beginning, the last premise is with regards to optimization for efficient communication.
Yes.
I mean, at least from how I understand evolutionary processes, things tend to get optimized to a point, and beyond that point, further optimization doesn't occur except through chance. So, is it sensible to use that as a grounds to guide?
For sure. Yeah, that's a great point, and I agree that your benchmark shouldn't be perfectly optimized, because of course no system is going to be no biologically evolved system is going to be perfectly optimized, and maybe it's a failure of wording for me. So what I'm looking for is fewer than 3 trillion, right? So some way to say, yeah, relatively optimized. It should be sufficient for communication. Maybe that's all that I mean. It should be sufficient for communication. I guess we know that it's sufficient for communication. Maybe the question is, how can it be sufficient for communication given the rampant potential ambiguity that's present? That's maybe a better phrasing, and I appreciate the comment. Yeah, in the back, and then there.
All right. So it seems like one avenue for studying these ambiguities is to, as you had before, where you have to questions and have the ambiguities in there. But another one is that when you teach kids, especially like high schoolers, how to write, they have to suffer through what ambiguities they don't realize they're missing from context, right? And so they write things, they write their whole paragraph, all it says is this, and I don't know what this means yet, right? And I'm just curious if maybe there's some research to be done in that vein, like what do you have to teach people to know what context they didn't include when they're learning to write?
It's a fantastic question, and I think a lot of learning to write and actually learning to speak is learning either that heuristically or learning to do better audience modeling. Here's the thing, though. For so far, the literature, apart from this one study on prosody, most of the literature says that speakers don't do anything. That speakers are not intentionally modulating language in order to satisfy the demands of someone who's trying to resolve ambiguity. So that's what makes learning to write so challenging. There are things that people are doing that are unintentional signals that are probably just encoded, like when I say this with this intention because of affect or some other thing, this is how I produce it, here's the prosody that comes with it, and listeners are able to pick up on that. But when learning to write, when you don't have all those cues available, you now have to, and you don't actually have a good model of your interlocutor, right? Because it could be anyone reading it. It's not just this person who you normally talk to who knows everything, that knows all your references, knows all the people you know, knows what you like and what you tend to talk about. Now you have to do audience modeling. So you're actually doing something, not only are you doing something different because it's a different modality, but you're doing something different because as a producer, you usually don't worry about that stuff. Because again, the system is loaded for you to do easy stuff and for there to be stuff in context because of how the system works that allows a comprehender to pick up on it. I taught a seminar grad class on ambiguity this last quarter, and they do final projects, right? And one of the students, her thing was she wanted to write a children's book that teaches kids about ambiguity. But she discovered that she couldn't do that because she didn't know the literature, so her project ended up being a lit review of all the stuff you would need to know in order to write a children's book that teaches kids about ambiguity. But which is a fantastic outcome. What I learned from reading her lit review is that kids start learning about ambiguity at around 4 or 5. And that's also true in my own personal experience with my kid. That there are some interventions that can actually help. This has been done both with typically developing kids and with kids with ASD. There are things where you can walk them through a series of interventions that leads them to better detect what words may have multiple possible meanings. This is all lexical ambiguity. No one's done this for the more complicated stuff, the syntactic ambiguity and so on, with kids, as far as I know. But yeah, so there exist interventions. The harder case, like high school kids learning about attachment ambiguity, it could be who's in the pajamas. I would be shocked if some degree of explicit instruction didn't help. But as far as I know, no one's done it.
Cool, thank you.
Yeah. I think there actually. So here.
I have a
I'm good,
follow-up.
actually. Yeah.
Oh, you have a follow-up
It's a
on that?
follow-up. Yeah. So in terms of kids learning, do you think kids who are bilingual would be much better at detecting this ambiguity, learning ambiguity in general?
Right, where the premise is that they already have more metalinguistic awareness. So that's supposed to be one of the differences with bilingual kids, right? Is that they are more aware of this kind of crazy thing that it takes us a while to learn about language, which is that all the words are made up and most of them don't have any connection to their meaning. Bilingual kids develop that metalinguistic sense earlier, the sense of arbitrariness, and are more sensitive to word forms. Like they notice early on, oh yeah, because there's this one way to say this word with mom, and there's this other way to say this word with dad, and I kind of mean the very similar thing each time. That's interesting. So there's some idea that kids early on are more sensitive to ambiguity if they're bilingual. There are a couple of studies that have pointed kind of in that direction, only for lexical ambiguity. But I wouldn't say that there's a big literature on that yet. Yes.
Yeah. So the Chomsky thing is interesting to me. I find like what you did compelling. I find what he's saying compelling too. And I almost see like more room for agreement before. And I don't know either one of the works too well.
Sure.
But it seems like ambiguity. Like, what if the story was that clearly we know like the foundations for language evolved biologically. Like something about language evolved biologically. Like we don't know exactly what all was biological versus cultural, but we know that both of those happened. It kind of seems to me though that if language were to evolve and maybe I just didn't understand the argument, but if language evolved biologically, wouldn't we expect ambiguity in language? If it evolved for something other than communication, we actually would expect. Like there's got to be some part of language that did not evolve for human communication. I think, and like.
I mean, so that's Chomsky. So Chomsky's idea is that there was a random mutation, sometime say 50 to 200,000 years ago, that flipped a switch where early humans now had something, and that something is probably something grammatical. So it's probably the ability to nest things hierarchically. Maybe it's recursion, depending on which version of Chomsky it is. Maybe it's a more abstract computational operation than that. And maybe it's some specific principles of syntax, and that's it. So those things happen, and those were selected for, right? That adaptation, or that, not adaptation, that mutation was selected for because it allowed people to think better. That's the idea, the Chomsky idea.
Only people.
What's that?
Only people had this.
Right, in humans, yeah,
Okay.
that's right. And so I was willing to concede that. I don't think it's true, but I'm totally willing to concede that as a thing that may have happened.
Okay.
Sure, but it's not going to explain all the other rampant ambiguity, right? It's not going to explain.
Okay.
Right. So we still have to explain how you get from that stage, some 50 to 200,000 years ago, to human languages, which are these really rich, socio-technical systems with where you have 50 or 100,000 memorized words with all of this grammatical complexity, these meanings and secondary meanings and tertiary meanings on words and sentences. All that stuff has happened since then over the course of cultural time.
Right. Yeah.
Maybe humans have changed biologically in that time too, in order in an adaptation to this new technology of language too.
Yeah.
But it's in that time anyway, and that time period of change, that needs some explanation for why it still tolerates all that ambiguity. So I agree with you in principle. Yes, it could be that there was a mutation that happened 100,000 years ago.
And can you say it one more time? I'm sorry. I connected to ambiguity. How? Okay, then.
His story?
Yeah, his story.
So he's just denying. He denies 3 and therefore 4, and says. So he says these two are true. Ambiguity is prevalent.
He's denying that language evolved for human communication.
Correct.
Okay.
Right. The interesting part.
That one biological change he said is not for communication.
Correct.
Okay. Thank you so much.
I'm sorry. Yes, here and then there and then.
So you mentioned a bunch of levels of ambiguity within language.
Right.
And most of them, well, I think all of them were within the context of natural languages. You briefly mentioned programming languages, but I'm just wondering, there are constructed languages like Lojban that have tried to basically remove syntactic ambiguity and have, try to not have homophones and things like this.
Yes.
How does that affect how people use ambiguity practically? And for example, does it have an impact on the 80 to 90% of indirect statements that people make within
when they're using constructed language?
When they're using
I wish. So you're asking the person next to the right person. So I've actually done work on constructed languages, but only Esperanto, and because it turns out, as it turns out, Esperanto is a constructed language, and I went out and discovered that there are native speakers of this language and studied them, and that's a great paper that you can look up from 20 years ago. Yeah, I know Loblan and Lodban, which I guess is the successor of it, are designed exactly for that purpose. They want to excise ambiguity from the language, and I haven't yet done the work of studying those people. I think it would be super fascinating to see. I would be shocked if there weren't tons of pragmatic ambiguity, even if they can get rid of lexical and maybe most syntactic ambiguity. There's still got to be all kinds of other stuff, and there's still be signal ambiguity too, right? Because they're two word, the same. So a sequence of 2 words isn't going to sound necessarily. It is going to sound the same as a sequence of 2 other words if you just segment them differently. So maybe it decreases ambiguity, but yes, that has been one of the main objectives since Spinoza of inventing artificial constructed languages, has been to try to get rid of ambiguity. Yeah.
Now open the floor to all.
Okay. Yeah, in the back and then here.
Yeah, I just kind of want to follow up on Matt's questions, because it seems, how do I say this, it seems that maybe computer science style languages where they have this, universities have this particular reference for this thing, and that all the syntax is built in and structured in that way, where there is no ambiguity, maybe those are impossible to evolve, right? So I wonder maybe this is optimized. This is just the best you can get if you're a naturally evolving language. It's not that it's not that this is evolved poorly compared to the other ones. So this is the best one you can have because you can't evolve the other kind.
Yeah, that's right. This is the baseline question. Well, certainly it would be unlikely for humans, knowing all that we know about the messiness of humans, it would be unlikely to evolve in a population of more than 2, or maybe a population of more than 1, a truly unambiguous system. Yeah. So right. So there's a question of baseline. It's hard to know what the simulations would be that you would run to figure that out. No, but I absolutely agree that That's the wrong baseline. Nevertheless, there should be some selection against things that are really harmful to communication. And rampant ambiguity, if those two premises that I got at weren't true, if there weren't other clues in context, and if humans weren't, and if they weren't exactly the types of cues that humans are able to pick up on, for whatever conspiracy of reasons, whatever adapted to what, then it would be a big problem, right?
Totally right. Thank you.
Yeah. Then there were some questions over here. Yeah.
So you started off your talk with a series of humorous videos where humor was due to the ambiguity.
Yes. I'm glad you thought they were humorous. That was the intent. The intent was for you to like them and to like me. I got a half right? Good.
Yeah, you haven't heard my question yet. So I was wondering, oftentimes we humans go out of our way to do and say ambiguous things because it's fun and we're rewarded for that. And so I'm wondering what role, if any, you think humor has to play in the prevalence of ambiguity in the language.
So if the question is, great question, something I care about a lot. I've done work on humor, not on this type of ambiguity in particular, but yes, absolutely true. I think that the relationship is an exploitative one. So given that ambiguity exists, sometimes people augment or highlight, pay attention to that ambiguity. So there's a television show called The Office that made, basically its most frequent joke was, that's what she said, which is a play on potential ambiguity, usually pragmatic ambiguity, but sometimes lexical or syntactic ambiguity. So yes, this is a thing, absolutely, writers' rooms know about this. If you go to whatever it's called, movietropes.com, the ambiguous utterances is one of the movie tropes, for sure. Some people have gone so far as to say that this is one of the reasons why ambiguity emerged, like to serve this function. I don't know that I've seen any evidence for that in particular. That humor seems like an important function of language, but I don't know that ambiguity is used enough for humor, or that humor is used enough in general for that to be a pressure that would really lead to that so much. Yeah, there.
Kind of following up on the comment about the humorous videos, since there is a brand of humor that is focused, the intention is the ambiguity, and some of your research suggests that individuals who are better at theory of mind tasks are better at disambiguating sentences. Would there be a prediction that people who get humor are just better at theory of mind?
I mean, there's a little bit of an extrapolation.
Right.
I would love. So, the thing that I have more to say about, yes, I think that there may be some. It is possible in principle that there's a relationship there. I also think that so there's this phenomenon called dad jokes that does. So, first of all, did you know that dad jokes didn't exist before 2013 as a cultural concept? So there wasn't. So go to Google Trends and look up dad jokes. It's a thing that started in 2013 and really got big in 2014. The jokes existed, right? There's no doubt. Hi, hungry. My name is Dad. Like that existed. But so there are certainly individual differences in attention to ambiguity and deployment for humor. Whether that changes as a function of procreation and gender and age, I don't know. But yeah. One thing that we've started to look at a little bit is a sensitivity to ambiguities like these. Like, what time? Do you know what time it is? Mean something other than the request for the time, and look to see if that co-varies with other things. And so far, we haven't found anything, but it could have. Yeah.
I'm wondering how much of the processes that go into production to help with ambiguity are automatized versus some system that is very quickly taking into account current circumstances. So you can imagine, for example, in an acoustically noisy environment, that prosody might not be depended upon as much in an environment where the comprehender has to track the intentions of lots of people or the knowledge of lots of people, that just assuming that you know what they know would change. Is there evidence that suggests that people do this more online or have just developed a certain set of habits for common conditions?
there's like I said, there's very little evidence that they do it online. I don't know of a good noisy environment study. That's one that we've bandied about in the lab. I think it's a really good idea. But the typical setup is one where it's very straightforward. It's like a map task or something. I know what I know. I can see what you can see, and therefore what you know. And there are two objects that would be referred to with the same word. There's a mammal. There are two bats, a mammal and a baseball implement, right? And I know that you can see both of them. And I say pick up the bat, and I don't disambiguate. And there's no difference in the extent to which I disambiguate using anything, using prosody or using additional lexical stuff. So like the baseball bat or whatever. There's no difference, or very little difference, whether there's one bat or two bats for you. So people are largely not doing much, and it seems to be mostly just sort of routine. Like I have a model where I know when the understanding gets hard, I do this thing. That's the going line. I think that the literature understates the extent to which people are probably doing stuff are modulating stuff for ambiguity resolution. Like, no one's really looked much at reference. I think that's a place where it happens a lot. So when I'm referring to my dad, here and now, I say my dad. When I do it for in another context, I'm not going to be as explicit. I'll say dad or him. In the context, like we know we do that. We know we change pronominal reference, and so we've got some studies looking at that. So looking at, for example, we got a corpus study where we looked at natural conversations between people who either have a lot of common ground because they're related, the call home corpus, or people who are strangers from a different corpus, and different corpora, different topics of conversation and everything like that. But we looked at how much they use different types of reference, how much they use pronouns, how much they use proper names, how much they, how much is objecting to something. How much they use full noun phrases, how long those noun phrases are, and we find that in interactions with people that you have more common ground with, you're using shorter reference, you're using more pronoun, presumably because you share common ground, and that also changes over the course of the conversation. So you use shorter, more pronouns and stuff like that as you go through the conversation, whether you're familiar with the person or not. And so clearly you're doing something. Now, we don't have the experimental manipulation yet where we modulate how much context you share with the other person to really get at that. But I think that that's a place where people might actually be quite sensitive. Like, what do I know you know about what I'm referring to? What's in the situation model?
So you're one of the holdouts who hasn't been purchased by Google yet from the Neural Theory of Language Lab. And there are folks, like Shane and Nancy Chang, who are sensitive to this kind of stuff. But there are an extraordinary number of people working on AI and machine learning right now who are incredibly insensitive to this kind of stuff. Some of them I know personally are making more than $1 million a year annual salary, and there's this widespread belief, it seems, that you can do things like feed JPEG images into an image classifier and have an intelligent image classifier into the system, and then it turns out these things are subject to adverse attacks where you just change a couple of pixels that humans don't seem to notice, but the machine freaks out and classifies a rose as a peacock or a temple or something. And a lot of these problems, it seems to me, can be course corrected through multi-modal inputs and many more dimensions of context, right? And they're kind of starting to do this with self-driving cars, which don't just have cameras, but also have infrared systems and sonar systems and all sorts of other stuff, proximity detectors, blah, 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 GPS. So I guess it seems like a lot of those folks in industry would benefit from being a lot more sensitive to this problem of ambiguity and suggestions for various dimensions of context to utilize in order to reduce that ambiguity, for stronger. I mean, and then there's a whole like embodied cognition story, right? Like, if you believe the embodied cognition story, then hey, it's really useful to have a body because that grounds out the meaning of lots of these terms, and then we get to the more abstract terms through metaphor and stuff like that. So that's another reason to have diverse, kind of multiply convergent dimensions of input, right, in order to help specify meaning and understanding. So I don't know what I'm saying, but like, go get a job like
I know what you're saying.
consulting for Google and Yahoo and.
So thanks for the career advice. Did they get summers off? What's that?
You don't, unfortunately.
Yeah. So that all of the things that you say are true and interesting. I don't know. I go up to Google every once in a while and talk to those guys, and they are. I think that there are a whole lot of constraints on them, right? They need to make incremental progress on product.
Yeah.
And okay, so but listen to what you just said. So you said you could do a better job understanding language if you had video, for example, of the person talking. You want your Google Home to have a camera now? Look what happened when they actually accidentally shipped. Who was it? They shipped something with a camera that they didn't disclose into people's homes. What was it? It was like a thermostat or something that had a camera. I think.
Google Nest.
That's what it was, the Nest. Yeah. Yeah. I don't know. People are pretty sensitive. Yeah. So yes, I absolutely believe that your assistant would be able to do a better job if it had more multimodal information. And we know. So we do stuff in the lab where we can show that gesture improves, the gesture and gaze processing and all that kind of stuff improves reference resolution. We do driving studies, for example, where we show that a machine classifier is much better at figuring out what you mean when you say, "Oh, just pull over behind that one." Of course, it does better when you can do gesture recognition and gaze tracking. But yeah, and maybe people would like that in their car when they're talking to their, in 10 years when they're talking to their driver machine. But I don't know whether they necessarily want that in their houses.
Have you met Kurzweil?
I haven't met him, no.
You see, because there's like this incredible, ridiculous hyperbole in his published stuff, and he can't be that dumb in real life.
No,
that.
He's a smart guy.
All right, yeah, so okay, thanks.
Okay, good. Yeah.
The discussion so far has been really focused on a linguistically and culturally homogeneous group.
Yes.
And I'm wondering how much things change when you have interactions between people that recognize that they are from either a culturally different group or
yes.
they're talking to someone who has English as a second language.
Yeah.
There are clear cases where you can imagine mistakes, the proverbial ugly American that thinks when speaking to someone that has English as a second language, they should speak louder in order to disambiguate things. But I wonder if there isn't kind of the opposite, that someone that's high mentalizing may ascribe to the mental state of someone from a different culture things that they don't necessarily have, and therefore make mistakes with regard to these kinds of interpretations.
Interesting, yeah.
So I guess the question here is it possible that there's some U-shaped curves here with regard to some of these variables like mentalizing?
Yeah, you sort of over project. Huh, that's really interesting. I hadn't ever thought about. Let me write that down. I never thought about that.
This is a first for us, yes. Where a question is so good that the speaker stops to write it down.
Oh, I write down. I haven't been writing down questions. I apologize. Most of these are questions that I've thought about before. But no, I think this is the main reason to do this. I mean, I get to see and meet lots of interesting and exciting people, but also I get to ideas. Yeah. So yeah. So we. Is this a university made out of Lego? Not exactly. Don't worry about that. I'm sure that wasn't a weight bearing with. There's a header. So yeah, we've done a little bit on how people modulate expectations about disambiguation from non-native speakers. When it's the non-native speakers producing the language, because we expect that it's going to be the comprehenders who are doing most of the work, and we do find that people have different expectations. from native versus non-native speakers, but we have not looked at that sort of that mentalizing dimension. I do think that that is a fertile area to look at differences in production, though, because I do think that we know that there are lots of ways in which people entrain to or change their speech to match that of the person they're talking to at every level. You know, you start pronouncing words like, you know, I have this terrible affliction where I start talking like a Southerner every time I go to Atlanta. You know, it's like I don't even have, and it's bad. It's not even doesn't sound anything. At every level, right? And so, but it's possible, like you said, that there are people who sort of overcompensate in interesting ways that are maybe not culturally relevant or applicable or whatever. That's really interesting. That's worth looking at. No, Ben had a question.
Yeah, I just had another thought related to that and kind of taking it back to the learning question that we were discussing earlier, which is that to the degree that there's some audience design based on mentalizing, we're talking about an intervention for kids to learn about ambiguity. I was thinking if you have a young child, you assume that they're not able to do certain mentalizing things, and so you're going to disambiguate more for them. And so it seems to me that there might be some kind of feedback loop in there where you kind of have to make mistakes in your mentalizing attributions in order for them to learn about ambiguity in the first place.
Mm. That's interesting. I mean, a lot of child-directed speech is from other children, and I don't think children are doing any work to help. They're not helping, right? So they're going to get a lot of really noisy stuff anyway. But that is in general child-directed speech from adults is a really interesting potential place where you could see again sort of modeling their mental states and their sort of capacity changing what speakers do. But I don't know that there's actually been much work on that in particular, on whether people are modulating how ambiguous their language is for kids. It seems intuitively like they might, but I don't know. Look at you guys.
Well, and I said, some parents are going to do that more than others, probably.
Yeah, I mean, there's some cultures in which you just don't talk to kids until they can talk to you like an adult, right? Where it's other kids talking to kids largely. So not everyone is like English-speaking North American. Okay, do we have time for one more? Or are we all done?
We have time for the quickest little.
Okay, it has to be quick. You heard the man.
Okay, we have time for nothing. Let's